This week, I was working with a client who is an incredibly capable and talented woman. She's a choreographer and a director, and she teaches dance, and she had been helping with a children's community play. And if you've ever been part of a community theater, you know what a massive undertaking that is, right? She was working with children even, teaching them their lines, their dances, creating and fixing their costumes, modifying things on the fly, and working on it for several weeks every day. And I have been coaching her, through this month, and I asked her how it went. And it's just so interesting to me how brains work. But she's like, oh yeah, the play was fine. But what really bothers me is the cast party that happened the night that the play had happened. And she told me, I was excited to celebrate with the kids. They had learned their lines. They did their dances. They had worked through all of their nervousness, and they were vulnerable on stage, and they did really great. But what happened after is a parent approached me, and this is her telling the story. And this parent wanted to bring another child to the after party. And this friend was not one of the cast members. And this mom gave all the reasons to my client why this friend should go to the cast party after the play. She had been supportive all season. She had donated money. She had been really involved. And this kid even wanted to join the cast next year. But this child had never been part of the rehearsal. Again, they weren't part of the cast. And the party was explicitly for cast members only. And everybody knew that rule. But this parent kept pushing my client. And my client described it this way. She said, I felt bullied. She was so forceful. I felt like there was only one acceptable answer, and she just kept pressing me. And she was waiting for me to give in. And so eventually I just said yes. And I want you to realize that this coaching session was days later. And this was the part that was still weighing on her mind. Not how amazing the play was, but how she had, in her words, caved in, how she had been bullied. And she felt like she had let the other directors down, some of the cast members down by allowing this to happen. And she felt like she had to explain herself and do a lot of things. And she just says, I'm such a pushover. I am such a softie. And I feel like this is a pattern in my life. People treat me this way. And I think this parent even knew that and sought me out, and et cetera, et cetera. And we had a great coaching session. And what I offered her and what I want to offer you is a different frame for what happened. This incident was not a weakness. This was not a character flaw. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it had learned to do under pressure. It chose peace. It chose accommodation. It found the fastest way out of an uncomfortable moment. And how did it do that? It fawned. And today we are talking all about the nervous system response called fawning. Welcome to Burnout Solutions. My name is Mona Tippett. I am a registered nurse, a life coach, an emotional resiliency expert, and a mom. I love to help healthcare workers and caretakers and just busy, capable people understand their brain and nervous system so stress, overwhelm, and frustration do not run their life. Here on this podcast, we break down burnout, emotional overload, and survival patterns in simple human language. I love to give you practical ways to feel safer, calmer, and more present in your everyday life. You do not need fixing. What you need is support and a nervous system that knows that it's safe. Thanks for being here. Welcome to Burnout Solutions. Today we are talking about the fawn response. And I'm just going to get into it. I think a lot of times when we talk about our nervous system states, a lot of us are very familiar with fight or flight and even freeze. And these are reactions, as I've talked about before, in your body when it senses danger, when it has a threat. So you either run from it, you go still, you fight it, you seek after it. But there is a fourth nervous system response that doesn't get as much attention, even though I feel like it's very common, if not even more common. And this is called the fawn response. And this is a survival strategy And when I talk about survival strategies, an interesting thing about all of our nervous systems is this isn't actually threat in a physical sense. More often than not, our nervous system is protecting ourselves from mental danger, emotional danger. And in the fawn response, we want to appease. We want to please someone who poses a threat against us. And we want to be accommodating. And so we do a fawn response. And this response was first coined by a therapist, Pete Walker. And he said that fawning happens when fighting back feels impossible. Fleeing isn't an option, and freeze won't keep us safe. So instead, we learn to make ourselves useful, agreeable, or invisible to avoid conflict or harm. And again, this is more often emotional and mental harm than physical harm. This is what I love about the nervous system. I love that the nervous system describes the why behind our behavior. And what I love to do is take all of this science and help us understand ourselves better, understand other people better, and help make sense of why we do what we do. So in the fawn response is when we experience a threat, our body quickly assesses which response will be best and give us the best chance of staying safe. The fawn response is one of the flavors of dorsal vagal, and it activates when other strategies have failed or they feel too risky. And all of these states happen in the unconscious. Our nervous system makes this calculation in milliseconds based on past experiences and our current circumstance. So often when we grew up in an environment where appeasing others kept you safer than any other option, our body learned that that was safe, and it often defaults to fawning. Now, a lot of people confuse fawning with people pleasing or having a naturally agreeable personality. They just call it being nice, being somebody who doesn't rock the boat, being somebody who just goes with the flow. Now, those are certain personality types, and that is okay. So how do we know the difference? And the difference is crucial. People pleasing might be a personality trait or just a social preference, but fawning is a nervous system response. It often is a survival adaptation that developed when our safety depended on managing other people's emotions or behavior. And that's what we're trying to do. We are creating safety, pretending to create safety so that we can avoid a reaction. You're not choosing to be helpful or kind in this situation, but you're responding to what you perceive as a threat. And even if that threat isn't obvious to others or even to yourself, we often, fawning became a way that we got our needs met or we could avoid further conflict or harm. A lot of us have a very low tolerance for conflict. A lot of our nervous systems like to avoid conflict at all costs. And we learned that it's super easy to keep other people happy. And when we do that, we avoid conflict and we avoid harm. So I just wanted to talk for a minute about how a fawning pattern can get created. This doesn't always happen, but a lot of times it's just emotional neglect. And I understand that as parents, we are not perfect. So we're not, again, blaming our parents. This is just something that maybe they were modeled and they model fawning to you. Maybe you had a caregiver that didn't notice when you were upset, who maybe asked about your day and didn't really listen, who, we were not taught how to name our emotions and navigate our feelings. But a lot of times as a parent, we are emotionally unavailable. We physically are there, but psychologically absent, right? So maybe you were sitting at the dinner table feeling invisible, or when you were sad, you weren't allowed to cry in the house. You had to go and cry alone in your room while life continued normally outside your house. These moments often feel too small to be memorable, too small to count as trauma, but they really are tiny traumas, and they help shape patterns of fawning. Why? Because children are hardwired to secure attachment with their caregivers, and because attachment means survival. When your caregivers were emotionally unavailable, you don't give up on connection as a child. You adapt. You become a student to how those caregivers are feeling. You learn to read the micro expressions in subtle shifts in tones, in how they talk, in the way that they say things. You discover that when you can anticipate the needs of other people and manage their emotions, you make yourself useful, and that earns you bids of attention. That calms down the conflict, that avoids the conflict. And so you feel safe and secure by creating that safety, by giving up your needs. And that fawning turned into a pattern, and our identity formed around external validation rather than internal validation and internal knowing that we have needs and it's okay to express them. Often we can learn that when we tune into everyone else's frequency and monitor those, we lose reception to our own signals. And this creates the perfect condition for a pattern of fawning. And it becomes an autonomic response to relationships. And this often happens in caregiving. We become so good at caring for others and their moods and their needs that we forget our own. And so we make a profession out of it, right? And this is a beautiful adaptation for caregivers to do. They are fawners, and they forget that they have their own needs. And we become very good at fixing or helping or being attuned to the needs of other people while ignoring our own. Okay, so let's just give a few examples of what fawning looks like in adulthood. So one example is you agree before you've even considered what you actually think, such as maybe somebody suggests a restaurant that they want to eat at, and you immediately say, yes, of course. Even though you have no interest in going there, you don't say, oh, I've been wanting to try this place, maybe we could go here instead, or you don't even bring it up. You go to a restaurant, even if you don't like that type of food. You might struggle to form opinions without first gauging what other people want to hear. And I have some people who are very, very close to me who fit this. When you ask what they want, they're like, oh, whatever you want. They're very chameleon-like. Whoever they're around, that's what they want to do. Wherever those people want to go, that's where they want to go. And when you ask them to think about something, they're very non-committal. They don't have an opinion, and they often over-explain. They justify simple requests with lengthy backstories. It's almost like they need to justify and earn a right to have a preference. Often, fawning can look like constantly apologizing, like starting every sentence with, I'm sorry, but I was wondering, or I'm sorry to bother you, or sorry, can I just ask you to help me with this? You apologize for taking space, for having needs, for existing in ways that might inconvenience anybody around you. The difference between just going with the flow and fawning is the emotional landscape that is underneath. These people are pretending or faking connection, but underneath they have anxiety. So often your chest feels tight when you need to hold a boundary. Your heart races when you consider saying no. The thought of somebody being displeased or disappointed with you creates a disproportionate sense of dread, and it just doesn't feel like it's worth it. Guilt arrives immediately after you set even the smallest boundary. You told someone that you couldn't help them move, or you couldn't help them do something, you couldn't pick up a shift, and now you feel terrible. And that's the thought that runs in your mind over and over again. I should have done this, I should have helped, I could have made it work, etc., etc. And you don't feel safe unless you do accommodate. Maybe you canceled plans because you were exhausted, and then you felt guilty all evening for doing that. Okay, these are fawning things. You live in fear of others' negative emotions. Their disappointment feels to you like you created a personal failure. Their frustration in that moment feels like a threat to you. You could be constantly scanning faces for signs of displeasure, for signs of, I'm not okay with that. And you navigate and change your behavior and emotions when you detect something and you rush to fix it. You want to avoid conflict at all costs, and you forget yourself in that. Now, often people who fawn find themselves in relationships that continue the pattern. So they are with somebody who's more controlling, more demanding. They have a high tolerance for conflict. And these dynamics feel familiar, even comfortable. And so, in a very strange way, that's why they continue that. They're drawn to people who have strong opinions, because that means that they don't have to have an opinion. They don't have to form their own. They don't have to hold a boundary, because it's very easy to continue the pattern. You have a strong opinion. I don't. Let's keep moving. These people often feel responsible for others' emotions in a way that extends far beyond normal empathy. And this is the difference. When your partner or your coworker is upset about work, you feel like you need to fix it. When your friend is disappointed, you feel like you caused it. You carry the emotional weight of everybody around you. And this chronic overgiving just continues to show up in your relationships. You give more time, energy, and resources than you receive, and you tell yourself, oh, this is fine, I don't need much. But underneath, you feel depleted, you feel burned out, and it can create resentment. And again, I see this in caregivers all the time. And it's hard to get to know these people because they are constantly shifting to match their surroundings. They are chameleons again. You might think you know somebody, but then you see them in a different setting and they're a completely different person. These people also have a huge identity on serving others. Their identity is built on being helpful, accommodating, and easy. Without somebody to please or a need to meet, they often feel lost. And the question, I ask this so many times to my clients, what do you want? It creates genuine confusion because they've spent so much of their life not caring about what they want, not looking at what they want, and asking other people what they want and trying to fill that role to do it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about fawning versus healthy empathy and how we can understand the difference. Because again, as healthcare workers, as teachers, as caregivers, we want to be empathetic, but we don't want to give ourselves away and forget all of our needs. They can look very similar from the outside. They both involve tuning into somebody else's needs, offering support, adjusting your behavior to maintain connection. But the real difference lives entirely in your internal experience. So healthy empathy comes from choice. You consider somebody else's feelings. You weigh your own capacity. You take into account how you are feeling and you decide what feels right to offer. You might help a friend move, or you might pick up a shift even though you're tired, but you could say no and it would be okay. Fawning operates from compulsion. You agree before you've even checked in with yourself, because the possibility of disappointing somebody else and triggering them can trigger in yourself a deep wound that will set you off. We feel safe because we make others feel safe. Healthy empathy might leave you tired, but there's a sense of fulfillment. There's a sense of connection. I did that and I chose to, and I wanted to. Fawning, on the other hand, leaves you depleted. It leaves you resentful. It leaves you wondering, why the heck did I say yes again? And that resentment is a crucial signal. And I just did a podcast on resentment. We're running in themes here. When you give from a genuine place, even from a sacrificial giving place, it doesn't breed bitterness because you're choosing it. You are living with intention, with authenticity. But when you're fawning, resentment builds because you've abandoned yourself in the process and you've put your needs aside to help somebody else and keep them comfortable, putting their needs above yours. And you did not hold a boundary. You didn't support yourself. And You just wanted what was best for the other person's comfort. So you can ask yourself a question that can help you decide, am I fawning or am I doing this with intention? Let's talk about that. So you can ask yourself, am I doing this because I want to, or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't? I really do believe that fear is such a driving emotion, and some fear here can be subtle. It could be like a vague dread of attention, or an automatic assumption that someone will withdraw or not give you the attention and love that you want if you set a boundary. Healthy empathy preserves your sense of self while you can connect to others. You remain present in the equation. Fawning erases you entirely. Your preferences, your limits, your feelings become irrelevant. Okay? So, what are some other questions we can ask? We can say, do I know what I actually want in this situation? Or am I only tracking what the other person wants? So think about it. What do I want? How can I live with authenticity and intention here? Am I saying yes to avoid conflict? Am I saying yes because I want to? Do I have a preference here? And is that something I can voice safely? If not, why is it so intolerable? So you can ask yourself another question. Can I imagine saying no without feeling panic or dread? Can I sit with the discomfort of saying no? And am I okay with that uncomfortableness? Another question, after helping or accommodating, do I feel connected or do I feel used? Do I feel resentful? Am I upset that I said yes? The next question, am I choosing this action or does it feel like the only option? When we feel stuck, when we feel like we have to say yes, I have a podcast called Giving an Intentional Yes. It talks all about that. But is this something that I'm operating through my core values, or is it something that I'm feeling obligated to agree to? Another insightful question is, would I make this choice if I knew the other person wouldn't be upset with me either way? You know, if I thought about my own needs here and voiced them, would I still do it regardless of the other person and their reacting? So think about that. So now that we know about fawning and the nervous system response behind conflict, let's talk about, why does our nervous system keep choosing it, especially when we can see, sometimes even in the moment, that it does cost us something. And I think there are 3 big reasons that I wanted to talk about. And the first one is that it works. And this sounds super simple, but I want you to really think about it. Fawning isn't irrational. It isn't a malfunction. When we accommodate someone who's applying pressure, the pressure stops, right? The parent at the cast party relaxed and your nervous system registered, okay, that works. And short-term relief is one of the most powerful teachers that our brain has. When a behavior produces relief, especially relief from something the nervous system is reading as a threat, the brain files it away and says, okay, good job. That was the right move. Do it again. It worked last time and it will work in the future. This, again, is not a weakness, but that is how your brain and nervous system learns. It learns through experience. The problem is that your brain doesn't always update the files. It doesn't realize just because that worked last time, let's not repeat that, because in repeating that, we're forgetting about ourselves. It just keeps running the same program that worked before. Okay, idea number 2. For a lot of us, this pattern started early. I talked about this a little bit before, but fawning doesn't usually begin at work or at school or at a cast party or in our teenage years or with a certain coworker at a job. It often begins in childhood, in environments where reading the room and adjusting yourself accordingly was genuinely necessary. I talked about that a little bit. Maybe you had a parent whose moods were unpredictable. Maybe in a classroom, a lot of children fawn based on the teacher. You got very good at sensing what kind of mood people were in the moment you walked into the door. And so you calibrated your behavior accordingly. I think so many of us do this, right? Like, Dad's in a bad mood today. Don't talk about that. Or today's not a day to bring that up because so-and-so has had a bad morning. So maybe approval in your family was conditional. Maybe approval was tied to your performance, being good, not making waves. And creating conflict was genuinely unsafe. And so we learned to smooth things over by fawning. I just am so fascinated at how kids are extraordinarily intelligent, adaptive creatures. As children, we learn that being agreeable, helpful, understanding, and attuned are what adults want, right? And then we are recognized for that. We are awarded for being those kind of people and people who keep things safe and calm and being the helpful ones. And that is rewarded. And so our brain wants to continue that. And they even practice it and get better at it thousands and thousands of times. And then it just carries over with us. The third reason is fawning often feels like a virtue. And this is a very sneaky one. And it's the one that makes fawning so hard to catch, even when you're someone who is actively working on it. Fawning doesn't actually feel like fear. It feels like being flexible. It feels like being kind. It feels like being the bigger person. It feels like I'm not making everything about myself. These are values that high achievers and caregivers hold deeply. So when the nervous system fawns and then the brain labels it, I was just being considerate, there's no internal alarm bell. The behavior gets reinforced as good character instead of getting flagged as a survival pattern. And again, ask yourself the questions. How do you feel afterwards? Because genuine generosity, the kinds that come from being grounded, being in ventral vagal, where we are flexible, wanting to connect, but we do that from a place of I have needs and this is what I feel and I want to do this. And that's where we draw the line. Fawning just tends to feel like relief at first, and then often days later, hours later, it feels heavier. It feels like that low-grade dread. It feels like that irritability that you can't quite place, and a sense that something was taken from you that you can't get back. So I also thought about fawning as a parent. Fawning can create just complications. You might over-accommodate your children to avoid conflict, to avoid seeing them struggle. You have a hard time enforcing boundaries or saying no to your children's requests because you're parenting from guilt rather than from values. You're constantly questioning whether you're being too strict or causing harm, or when should I say yes? When should I say no? Your children's disappointment feels unbearable, right? So you sacrifice your own needs and your own boundaries, and sometimes your own children's development to prevent that uncomfortable feeling. Okay, so how can we overcome fawning? And that is to help our nervous system tolerate discomfort that arises when we don't fawn. When we start setting boundaries and expressing your actual preferences in a kind, direct way, often your nervous system will flood you with anxiety and stress. And this reaction, of course, makes sense because your body learned a long time ago that pleasing others meant that you were safe. Healing involves gradual building of your capacity to stay present with the discomfort rather than immediately smoothing it over and people pleasing. So you practice, you notice that, you realize that you have that urge to say yes. You notice the feeling of the anxiety in your body and you're okay with it. And over time, your nervous system learns that you can survive with somebody else's disappointment. You can survive saying no and somebody being upset. You can survive holding a boundary and let go of that disappointment and fear of what other people think about you. So there is another side of the coin that I've thought a lot about, and that is If you are the pushy person on the other side who has a strong personality, who has a high tolerance for conflict, and that's what we're actually going to talk about next time. So thank you for listening. If you find yourself fawning and doing it often and have created that pattern, I would love to help you identify where we can change that and where we can work on it. So just schedule a call with me on my website, free 30-minute call on how you can overcome your fawning pattern and small applicable steps personalized for you and how to change that. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon. Every week, you're learning something new here on this podcast, and that is a powerful first step. But guess what? Information alone doesn't create transformation. True change happens when you start to think differently and shift the nervous system patterns that drive your behavior. As a coach and an emotional resiliency expert, that is the work I do. I love to walk alongside you, whether it's one-on-one, in a small group that you choose, or with your workplace team. I can help you retrain your brain and nervous system so that stress no longer runs the show. You'll find ways to connect with me in the show notes. Let's do this work together.